If you think that the middle game is the hardest part of the chess game, then you are not alone. The middle game is really difficult for many people because it's the one part of the chess game where you really need to think yourself. I mean, in the opening, you can memorize all the moves, and in the end game, well, you can understand the systems, but in the middle game, you really need to use all your brain power to come up with the different ideas. In this video, I'm going to try to make you a tiny little bit better at middle games, and I'm going to give you some ways that you can think so that you always know what plan you should have in chess. Now, the games that I'm going to be showing you that are basically going to be the example for this are going to be Magnus Carlsen games. So if you get all of the stuff that I'm going to tell you, well, then you might play middle games just like Magnus Carlsen does. So everybody, the way that we're going to do this is that I'm going to show you two different Magnus Carlsen games, and I'm going to be giving you a few different options of moves and plans that Magnus could have in this position. Now, what I want you to do is that I want you to guess or think about what you think the best option is out of the examples that I'm going to give you. Now, the reason that I'm going to do it this way is because in chess, when you're really trying to come up with the plan that you want to go for, you should have 3 candidate moves. Now, you shouldn't do this after every single move, but every time that there is a position where that position might really change the game, that's when you should have candidate moves. And candidate moves are basically different moves that you think might be good. So this position is from a Magnus Carlsen game. He was playing against Matthias Bluebaum, who's a really strong German grandmaster, in an online game. And this position, the reason I'm telling you that this is a crucial position in the game is because in this position, the queens might get off the board. And if they do, it's pretty much going to be an endgame. So in these sort of positions, if you're playing a longer game, you really should take a moment before you decide what you're going to do to come up with different candidate moves. And this is something that my grandmaster parents always used to recommend me in classical games. But you really need to know when you should do it. And the more you play, the better your intuition will get. And the better your intuition is, the more you'll understand when to do this. And the better options you'll come up with too. So in this position, before I give you the 3 candidate moves, let's look at some characteristics of the position. Here we can see that Magnus, who's playing with the white pieces, is 1 pawn down. But Magnus has a pretty safe king right now. All right, so we can see that Magnus is 1 pawn down. This queen and this bishop are both looking towards this bishop right over here. So if this knight would move to square where it's not defending this bishop would be fallen and it would be a checkmate. Now, what is going on in Black's position? Well, Black is a pawn up, but they have a pair of double pawns, right? So these 2 pawns are double. And also there's a hole in front of the king. The little perfect king box is not perfect. It's not complete. The box is open, you know? So there's this big hole, which means that this king is actually right now slightly weak. Now, Black has the bishop pair, which is pretty good. Black has not developed all pieces. This knight still needs to develop. And actually, these 2 pawns, one might say, are a little bit weak, especially this a6 pawn, as this rook is looking towards this pawn. So these are the characteristics of this position right now. So let's, out of these characteristics, come up with a few different candidate moves. The first one is going to be exchanging queens. Queen takes d5. I mean, in chess, you should always look at all the checks, captures, and attacks. And I've done a video about this, but it's always good to reiterate that. I think that's a word. It's always good to remember that, right? So that's why I'm saying it again. So checks, captures, and attacks, super important in every position. Really go through them because that's the way you're going to be finding the most forcing move. So queen takes d5 is a move that needs to be considered. Another move that we might have to consider is a move such as going knight h4, where you're basically moving the knight to a square that's defending this bishop, but you're also threatening the queen and the other bishop. So this might be a good move to calculate because there might be some tactical ideas here. And the last move that we are going to consider is going to be to move the queen and not allow a queen exchange. In this position, we could either think about queen e1 or queen c1, Or maybe queen b1, but the queen here is super sad. I mean, this queen is being blocked by a pawn. This is super sad. So queen e1 I don't like because the queen is doing absolutely nothing here. It's completely useless. The queen is only looking at a pawn, which is right now already defended by a bishop. So I really do not like this move. So my last candidate move is going to be queen c1. So these are the three candidate moves: queen takes queen, knight h4, and queen c1. I want you to pause the video here and look at this position and calculate the three different moves that I've given you now. It's a little exercise, and then let me know in the comments which move you think is the best one out of those three. Now, two of these moves are really bad, and one of them is good. And obviously, Magnus did the move that was good. I mean, let's be honest, this is Magnus Carlsen. Of course, he's going to do that. But it's important to understand why. So if you've already paused the video, gotten your coffee, looked at this, whatever, I'm going to tell you now what the right move is. So because we are a pawn down right now, and we see that our opponent has characteristics such as having a weak king, in this position, what we really want to do is that we want to keep our queen so that we can attack this king. Because if we exchange queens, if we would go something like queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, to be honest, there's not much more calculating that needs to be done, because we are right now going to be in an endgame, one pawn down, and we are not going to have any chances, any practical chances really, to win this game. I mean, we're just going to be much worse. If we go knight h4, this is the one move that we might have to actually calculate. Well, if bishop takes knight, then we will take the queen. And if the queen goes somewhere, we'll take the bishop. But let's say there's queen takes d1, we take the queen back, and now bishop takes g2, we capture back with either with the king or with the knight, it doesn't really matter. What we're going to see is that right now we are still in an endgame, one pawn down. So the only viable move in this position for us to try to win the game is to go queen c1. What is the idea of this? The idea is to try to get the queen all the way up to h6 and take control of all of these dark squares, which are right now pretty weak, as there's no pawns that are defending these squares. But also, right now, we have these two knights that are very close on getting to the king. I mean, knight f4 could be a threat, queen h6, knight g5 at some point could be a threat. So these two knights are actually really close to this king, and together with the queen, they might become amazing. Typically, we say that knights and queens work really well with each other. They complement each other perfectly because the knight is the only piece that is able to do things that the queen is not able to do. So knights and queens complement each other fantastically. So here we're also building up an idea of going rook d1 and kicking away this queen. So this move is also opening up for another one of our pieces to get inside of the game. So queen c1 is an amazing move, and this is the move that Magnus did, and it's actually a move that pretty much equalizes the game, even though white is right now a pawn down. So if you guessed this correctly, good job, clap to you. You get 5 stars, amazing stuff. So let me show you how the game continued, because Magnus was able, from this position, being a pawn down, to beat 2 pawns up. And let me tell you how he did it. So here, knight c6 was played. And now he went knight f4, kicking away the queen. Now, this is all part of the plan of going queen c1. So now he went knight h5 with the idea of maybe bringing up the queen to h6. This knight right here is really amazing. And if this bishop would go somewhere random, there would be queen g5 check, queen g7 checkmate. So here, Matthias found no other option than to go for quite a desperate move, which is to go f4, sacrificing a pawn, but stopping the queen from coming up to g5. And now in this position, the absolute best move is to go knight takes f4, because if you take with either the pawn or the queen, the knight is hanging. So knight takes f4, and now bishop f6 was played. Now here, this is not a position where, you really need to come up with different candidate moves because there's not really any big change that's about to happen here. But typically what you want to do is that when you're coming up with middle game plans and you're playing your middle game, you always want to place your pieces in the best squares possible. And we can see right now that this bishop right here is pointing towards this pawn on b2, and this queen right here is defending it, but we don't want a queen to be defending from a threat of a bishop. I mean, it's sort of like, I don't know, what can I say? I mean, it's sort of like an elephant being scared of a bee. It's such a big animal. You shouldn't be scared of such a tiny animal. You know what I mean? So in this position, actually, it's going to be a really good move to go knight d3, moving this knight, which right now couldn't really go anywhere, back to d3, threatening the queen, but also defending this pawn on b2 so that this queen is free to move around, and a piece of the same worth as the one that was attacking this pawn is defending it. This knight is also right now threatening this pawn on b4, sort of, so this knight is really good placed here. So queen f5 was played. Now queen e3, finally the queen can move. The queen is now looking towards different holes in the position, aka squares that are not defended by another pawn, such as this b6 square right here. So rook a d8, queen b6. Now the queen is entering the position, threatening the bishop, and now it was hard for Bluebaum to find a way of defending everything. He should have gone rook b8 here to keep everything defended, but instead he went bishop a8, and now rook takes a6. Magnus was able to win the first pawn, and after this move, takes and takes, he was able to win the second one. So from the initial position that I showed you, right over here, where I told you that these two pawns were kind of weak, Magnus found a fantastic way of really taking that characteristic of the position and, win those pawns, which is awesome, right? So, I mean, I can show you a little bit, what happened in this game. He was able to win this pawn. There were a couple exchanges, and here, I mean, Magnus just played really well. He was 2 pawns up, and now when he's 2 pawns up, he wants to exchange and trade all pieces, right? So I'll just show you really quickly what happened here. I mean, this became kind of tactical, but Magnus just very nicely kept the control of the position, and after queen f8, queen g7 was a checkmate. So this is the first game that Magnus was able to win, but it really started in that critical position where I told you to think. If you would have this position and you wouldn't take your time to think in that position, this game might not unfold in this way. And also, I mean, if you're not Magnus Carlsen, maybe this game will not unfold this way. But you know what I mean. You know what I mean. So we're going to do this one more time. This is position number 2, and this is the critical moment where one needs to think about the different candidate moves. Now, in this position, we are playing as Magnus Carlsen's opponent. Imagine that you are Pranav and that you're rated 3000 on chess.com, and you have this position with the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen. So in this position, I'm going to tell you a few different candidate moves. The first one is going to be to go castles, which looks like a very natural move. So short castles. The next move that I'll tell you is to go for long castles, okay? And the last move that I'll tell you is to go g5. Those are the 3 candidate moves. Now, whilst you're thinking about this, and take a moment now to pause the video and think about what, the best move out of those is, let's look a little bit about the characteristics of the position. We can see here that White has already castled. So White has already decided what part of the board the king is going to go to. And they also pushed this h pawn up to h4. So this pawn is maybe slightly weak right now. And it's also kind of opening up the box in front of the king. Now, we can also see that White has advanced this a pawn, and the b file is open right now. And also White is threatening kind of to capture this bishop on c6. So what can we say with Black? Well, Black hasn't really decided where to castle yet, and Black can now castle if they want to. All pieces are developed. There's some great squares. This knight is kind of looking at this pawn. This knight has some great squares to jump to at some point, maybe. But another characteristic that we can see here is that Black has the opportunity of really creating an attack against this king. Now, the move that, and this is maybe going to give you, quite a big hint, but I'm going to tell you now what the best move is. In this position, the absolutely fantastic move that Pranav was able to make was this move g5. And this is a beautiful move that at first might be hard to understand, but the thing in this position is actually that if Black just simply would go short castles or something here. Black would be totally fine, but after something like knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, actually in endgames, black might be slightly worse because these pawns might be kind of bad in this position. But I mean, it would still be like totally fine. It wouldn't be like a terrible move, but you would miss the opportunity of going g5. And this is just a beautiful move. And this is the move that Pranav did. And what is the idea of this move? The idea is that you're either going to be, winning a pawn. You're threatening both the queen and the pawn. You're either going to be winning a pawn or you're going to be opening up the h file for the rook. I mean, one of those two things are going to happen. So in this position, Magnus captured on g5, and after takes, queen moves. Now black has everything that they want, which is that they have an open file. This h file that is basically a file next to a king is now open, and this rook is going to become incredibly strong. But it doesn't finish here. It really does not end here. Now knight c5 was played, and what one needs to understand here is that the idea is going to be to double up these rooks, which is what you're going to see. So after a5, now the best move is not to go long castles, which, you may think is the best move, but it's actually to go king d7, which is actually really beautiful. The king goes up to the center because the king is safer in the middle of the board together with all the other pieces than what it is on c8 all alone. So king d7, and now after knight f3, rook h5, and after queen g4, rook h8, and look at this beautiful idea of doubling up the rooks on this h file. I find this absolutely beautiful. And the moment where he could go g5 was really the moment that set precedent for him being able to get this position, because he understood that the plan here was not to just castle and get a very symmetrical, but get a lot of traits and enter a sort of endgame. But the plan here was to attack this king because white had moved up the h pawn before black had decided where to castle. If black would have castled short side here, all of this thing would not be possible. But because the rook was still on h8, this move was possible. So here, now after king f1, which was the move that Magnus had to do to run away with the king, this position is -3 for Pranav. It's completely winning. And here, he actually made a mistake. He went king c7, which is just a slow move. If he would have gone here, and this is another moment where you need to really look at the candidate moves because you have such a good position, it almost looks like it's a checkmate. This is sort of position you really need to think about. How do I, finish the game? In Spanish we call it el remate final, which means the final, like the moment you do the final, like the game is over. You know what I mean? So here, what a great way of thinking would be is, what pieces do we want to exchange? And actually, the only piece right now that's defending this king, it's this bishop. This bishop right here is stopping black's bishop from getting to b5 and pretty much checkmating this king. But we do not want to trade here because after knight takes d3, pawn takes, this pawn is going to be blocking this diagonal. We want to open up this diagonal. That's what we want to do. So the best move in this position, which would be completely winning, is to go knight e4 with the idea that if bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and now we've eliminated the bishop that's defending the king. Now, what is the threat? Well, if let's say that white does something completely random, the threat right now is to, at some point, be able to basically go knight c3 and stop the king from escaping. But in this position, there's so many amazing moves. You can go queen b4, you can go rook h1. Now, if king e2, there's going to be a check. You win the rook. If you go something like knight g1, well, then you can just go ahead and bring the next rook. But basically, the king is kind of trapped because the king can never move as there is knight c3 check. So knight e4 would have been amazing. And if you really understood this idea of what pieces you should exchange and thinking about candidate moves, this would be a move that you might come up with. So instead, king c7 was played. And now, he went kind of back and forth, which really was kind of surprising. He traded, and after, all the trades, this actually, even though it looks amazing for black, actually Magnus ended up winning this game. And another good thing to know is that when you are in a position of attacking, when your opponent's king is very weak and you're attacking that king, you never want to trade queens because you can only checkmate a king pretty much with a queen. So you really want to keep the queen, the most, monstrous piece of them all, on the board alive so that you can checkmate with that piece. So, I mean, this became an endgame, and we all know that Magnus Carlsen is just absolutely amazing at endgames. And at the end, Magnus ended up doing what Magnus does, which is winning and absolutely draw an endgame. I mean, I still do not know how Magnus does this, but we don't need to look through the whole game. This just ended up being a win for Magnus. So I hope that these two positions kind of give you some new ideas. But really try to think about, you know, this whole thing about candidate moves, coming up with different moves, and then after calculating those moves, like choosing what you think is the best. And also remember to know what pieces you want to trade. What are your opponent's best pieces, and how are you able to trade your bad pieces for their good pieces? Those are some things that really will make you know what to do in the middle game more. And also, being able to understand what the best square for your pieces are, how to reroute your knight to a better square, how to activate your rooks, how to use your queen from a pretty normal position to attack your opponent's king, all of those things. When you're able to, 1, put your pieces on the best squares possible, 2, go for candidate moves in times of need, and 3, knowing what pieces to trade, you will become a GM in middle games, pretty much. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you learned something, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.